All right, Dr. Eric Balcavage, we're back for another edition of Thyroid Answers Shorts. And today we're talking about thyroid antibodies. Do thyroid antibodies tell the whole story? So in this episode, and these are the shorter episodes, I like to cover just one topic versus the kind of the long form podcast where I'm talking to somebody usually for maybe closer to 90 minutes. If there's a topic that you would like discussed on a Thyroid Answer Short, please, you can email me at info@drericbalcavage.com. What's the topic you want covered? And I'll do my best to get a Thyroid Shorts episode done on it. If there's the listeners who say, man, I think I'd like to hear Dr. Eric interview so-and-so, let me know who that person is. I'm more than happy to have almost anybody on the podcast to have a discussion or debate regarding different aspects of functional medicine or thyroid physiology. And because I do this for for a large part, I do this for the listeners. Who do you want to hear? Who would you like me to interview on the podcast? Send me your suggestions to info@drericbalcavage.com. But let's get on with today's topic of this episode of Thyroid Shorts. Do antibodies tell the full story? So let me go through a typical scenario. And yes, I have to put my glasses on now that I'm getting a little bit older. For the average person, they go to their primary care physician. They get diagnosed with a thyroid condition, and their medical doctor runs TSH, free and free T4. TSH is high, free T4 is low. They get diagnosed with primary hypothyroidism. Then you get put on T4-based medications, typically in an allopathic model, and you might have some improvement, but maybe limited improvement. And so then you and your doctor start tinkering with the dose. You increase it, you decrease it, you increase it, you decrease it, trying to find this magic dose of T4 medication that is going to restore your health and well-being. And many times it leads to frustration. Many times it leads people to feel better than they did without thyroid medication, but ultimately they don't feel back to optimal health. And I call this thyroid purgatory. You're kind of stuck in this in-between zone. This is what typically leads people to go then search out options, integrative medicine, functional medicine, and say, okay, there's got to be other ways to improve my thyroid physiology and maybe different ways to look at it. So now you go to an integrative or functional practitioner who's what I would call a manager, and they may run TSH, and then they may add free T4, free T3, reverse T3, and thyroid antibodies. And if your thyroid antibodies are positive, TPO or thyroglobulin, you may get diagnosed by them as saying, hey, look, your medical doctor didn't run your thyroid antibodies. Your thyroid antibodies are positive. You have Hashimoto's. It's not primary hypothyroidism. It's an autoimmune condition. And that's the reason you have a thyroid condition. Now, to be fair to the medical community, I think they've fully realized that the vast majority of people, especially in the United States, if they have primary hypothyroidism, that the primary cause is thyroiditis, right? Damage to the gland by the immune system. So I think they fully realize that. The thought process is somewhere around 90% of the cases in the United States are driven by thyroiditis, and which is an immune-driven damage to the gland. So from their standpoint, do I really need the antibodies to make a diagnosis of primary hypothyroidism and give them T4? No. In their model, it doesn't really matter whether it's immune-driven or not. They worry about, is the gland destroyed enough that there's not enough T4 in circulation that they need to give T4. And the diagnosis is based on an elevated TSH and a low free T4. And then the treatment strategy is give enough T4 to suppress TSH. And if they're really concerned, they'll look at TSH and free T4 on an ongoing basis. So it doesn't really change the medical model. Therefore, they don't run the antibodies many, many times. But in the functional medicine community, this may make a big difference. So if your antibodies are positive, they'll say you have Hashimoto's. It's an immune condition. And if you don't have Hashimoto's, I've seen where practitioners say you don't have an immune condition. Maybe we just need to give you iodine or MP or maybe some types of cofactors that'll help, or that, hey, you've got damage to the gland for some reason and you have primary hypothyroidism, but it's not an immune condition. And we're going to give you what's going to be better for you is a combination of T4 and T3, because the medical community must not realize that thyroid gland makes T4 and T3. So we're going to give you T4 and T3. The problem with that is that the medical community fully knows that the thyroid gland makes both T4 and T3. But the general feeling is that if somebody's in homeostasis, low stress state, and their gland's damaged, and you give them T4, the body has a really good system in place to convert T4 to T3 and maintain T3 levels. But when somebody has a hypothyroid condition, there are people that are given T4, but they don't convert well that T4 medication to T3. And this is part of the functional and integrative spaces philosophy, that since the thyroid gland makes both T4 and T3, that if you're going to provide thyroid medication, it should be a glandular product that has both T4 and T3. And to some degree, I agree with that. If you had your thyroid gland removed or irradiated, it was totally destroyed, yeah, you should probably take some T4 to match what a healthy thyroid gland would have made. And you should probably take some T3 to match what a healthy thyroid gland would have made, maybe 5 or 10 micrograms, somewhere in that range. But I think we see too often today in functional and integrative medicine where clinicians are they're looking at the reduced conversion of T4 to T3, and they're looking at lower T3 and free T3 levels and elevated reverse T3 levels, even on 5 to 10 micrograms of T3 medication, and thinking that the body is dysfunctional and you can't convert T4 to T3 anymore. And therefore we need to give more than the 5 or 10 micrograms of the thyroid gland would typically make. And I just don't believe that's the case from my management standpoint or my strategy when I'm working with clients. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So if you get diagnosed as having hypothyroidism and not having Hashimoto's, antibodies are negative, then the primary focus is probably going to be make sure there's some T4 and then try to optimize T3, free T3, and optimize reverse T3. And many clinicians think reverse T3 should be as low as possible because reverse T3 blocks T3 from binding to the receptors. And that's why we typically see people not do well in a functional medicine model, because they are, or in an allopathic model, is because we're only giving T4. The doctor's not looking at T3, free T3 and reverse T3, so they don't realize that the T4 is not converting. And when a functional or integrative practitioner runs free T3 and reverse T3, they can see that the body's favoring the deactivation of T4 to reverse T3, and that T3 and free T3 is typically what's run, is low. So their assumption is the body's broken. We need to give more T3. If we give more T3, that can overwhelm the reverse T3, and there'll be less T4 in the system to convert to reverse T3 and block T3. And it all makes a fun story, but it's not really reality. That's not really what's going on. Your body didn't forget how to convert T4 to T3. It didn't all of a sudden, by mistake, start converting it to reverse T3. And reverse T3 doesn't block T3 from binding to any significant extent based on the literature. But the question is, we look at these things differently. Allopathic medicine doesn't typically look at them. They're saying it doesn't really matter. We assume for the most part it's an immune-driven condition, and the immune system is only going to destroy the thyroid gland. So we just let it go, and then we just give thyroid medication, and that immune system isn't going to create damage elsewhere. That's probably not true. And then in the functional and integrative management community, they may look at this and say, if antibodies are positive, you got an immune or autoimmune condition, so we're going to manage. We're going to try and suppress the immune system, give things that suppress the immune system, vitamin D and other things that are going to suppress it. And then 2, we're going to provide sufficient levels of T3 to optimize the blood levels of T3 and lower the reverse T3 as low as possible. And they start to lose concern about TSH and lose concern about free T4 as the T3 starts to ratchet up. If the antibodies are negative, then the assumption might be that it isn't an immune-driven condition, and we definitely need to make sure we optimize T4 and T3 because the gland's not working for some reason, okay? But the question I would pose then is, do the antibodies being positive or negative really change the reality of what's going on. And the issue is that they don't, for the most part, because especially in the United States, the primary cause of glandular hypothyroidism is an immune-driven condition. And so it really shouldn't, whether thyroid antibodies are positive or negative, shouldn't really change our strategy, especially in functional medicine, which is identify root cause issues. Okay. The thyroid gland doesn't become dysfunctional for no apparent reason. The immune system doesn't become activated for no apparent reason. So let me talk about some of the kind of beliefs, the hypotheses that people believe because they've been taught these things. And one of those is that many clinicians believe that antibodies, TPO or thyroglobulin, cause the damage to the thyroid gland and cause hypothyroidism. And I think I was taught that too 20, 30 years ago. The reality is that the antibodies don't cause much of the damage. They don't cause nearly the amount of damage that we thought they did a couple decades ago. Thyroglobulin antibodies, based on the most recent research I've read, don't cause any damage to the gland. And TPO antibodies do or can create some damage, but it doesn't appear that it's the primary driver. Okay. So if you are a clinician that was taught that antibodies are what caused the damage, then if thyroid antibodies, TPO and thyroglobulin antibodies are negative on your blood work, then yeah, you would assume that, hey, they're not an immune-driven problem because it's the antibodies that cause the damage. The reality is that's not true. Okay. There are people who have Hashimoto's that don't produce antibodies or don't produce positive antibodies. And they're called seronegative antibodies. And early research said that, hey, there's a small portion of Hashimoto's patients that are seronegative, meaning they have immune-driven damage to the gland and negative antibodies. And the number was like 5% or less of the population. Now, I really had some challenges with that because oftentimes we're not running antibodies to see whether these people are seronegative, and we're not doing any follow-up studies to determine if they have Hashimoto's. And we weren't looking at T-cell subpopulations to see what's actually creating the damage. So now we start to see some literature that disputes this low percentage of people being seronegative. And I'll talk about that in a second. Another kind of hypothesis or thought process or belief was that if somebody had no antibodies, but they didn't have Hashimoto's, and that is not the case based on the literature today. We know that there's a lot of people that do have immune-driven problems going on and do not have antibodies. But for the clinicians that believe no Hashimoto's, no antibodies, no Hashimoto's, no immune-driven condition, then what's the strategy? Like, what are we trying to, what's the thought process as to what's going on? I guess some of these people believe that something else is driving the damage to the gland. Maybe it's micronutrient deficiencies, and that some of these people just needed more iodine, or they needed more selenium, or they needed more iron, or they needed some of the micronutrients that make up thyroid physiology. Maybe it's an estrogen issue, right? So they would start looking at non-immune driven conditions for the cause of the hypothyroidism to begin with. Maybe there's pituitary suppression that's causing the hypothyroidism. There are some in the community that believe that if there's no antibody, there's no Hashimoto's. And the reason people struggle under traditional care is that because the gland's not working for some reason, and the gland makes both T4 and T3, and the allopathic community was only giving T4. And so what we need to do, because the gland's being destroyed, is we have to give the T3. And I talked about why in a healthy person, many times we don't need to do that. If their thyroid gland's destroyed or irradiated, and they're in homeostasis following that, and you give them T4, they do fine. And they make plenty of T3, even without the thyroid gland there. The other thing sometimes people believe if there's no antibodies, there's no Hashimoto's, then why would these people still be symptomatic? And it's because they have a reduced ability to convert T4 to T3. And it's evident when a functional or integrated practitioner looks at a more comprehensive blood work than an allopathic physician ran. The allopathic physician would have run just TSH and free T4, and maybe this integrative or functional practitioner ran TSH, free T4, free T3, reverse T3, and thyroid antibodies, and they see, hey, the antibodies are negative. They don't have Hashimoto's, but the reason they're still symptomatic under traditional care is because they have an inability to convert T4 to T3, as evidenced by low free T3 and elevated reverse T3. And they also believe that that elevated reverse T3 is what's causing the problem. It's preventing T3 from binding to the receptors. And if the solution here is just to wind up T3, just give them lots of T3, ratchet up the T3 medication, so that way we can raise the blood levels of T3. That should raise the tissue levels of T3, and then that should overwhelm the reverse T3, and we should get more T3 binding, and people should feel better. And it all sounds good on paper. It's a great little story, but it's not really the reality of what's going on. So for people with no antibodies, no Hashimoto's, it's either micronutrient deficiency or it's an inability to convert T4 to T3, which is why those people didn't do well in a traditional medical model with T4 only. In the integrated space, if the person is antibody positive, the focus really shifts to suppressing the immune system and trying to optimize T3 levels. So combination T4, T3, and start ratcheting up T3 until we get into an optimal range, because it's assumed that if we suppress the immune system with immune suppressing supplements, and we manipulate T4 or T3, whatever your clinician cares about, into range, that will restore physiology. We just need to optimize the blood because there isn't an immune dysregulation going on. It's not an immune-based attack. But the reality, when we really start to take a look at this, is that antibodies do not cause most of the damage to the thyroid gland. It was once believed that the antibodies did, but it's now, there is a general consensus today that the antibodies do not cause most of the damage to the gland. There are cells in your body, immune cells in your body, that are part of the lymphocyte family, that are called T-cells, that are actually responsible for most of the damage that occurs at the thyroid gland. Another reality, we talked about that it was believed that there was only a small population of patients with Hashimoto's that were seronegative. So if antibodies are negative, the patient's probably negative, because only a very small portion of the people have Hashis and are seronegative. He said it was 5% or less. New research shows that the number is much higher than once thought. With new ultrasound and imaging techniques, some of the studies are showing that the seronegative population is somewhere closer to 30-35%. And they're saying, hey, the seronegative population is rising. I don't know that it's rising. I just don't think we ever really did a good job of really assessing the immune system in these patients. We assumed that the TPO antibodies and thyroglobulin antibodies were determining whether there was immune-driven damage to the gland. And now we know that it's not the antibodies that are actually creating the damage. It's the T-cell family that's really creating most of the damage. So if nobody's ever running antibodies, that makes it look, how would you know who's seronegative and who isn't? And then two, if you're not actually looking at immune studies or doing these, now that we have this better evaluation, AI assisted ultrasound, we can actually see that there's a lot more people that have thyroiditis going on, have Hashimoto's, and don't have antibodies. So the kind of the myth that it's only a small percentage of the people were seronegative doesn't appear to be true. And I don't know that the number of seronegative is actually growing, versus we're just doing a better job of detecting what's going on. For point 3, where I said if antibodies are negative, the person didn't have Hashimoto's. Well, we already now know that the scientific literature shows the antibodies don't cause most of the damage. And there's a lot more people that have thyroiditis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, but are seronegative, meaning they're not making antibodies. So if the antibodies aren't the driver, what's the purpose of them? What value do they actually have? And what thyroid antibodies do indicate is they kind of confirm there is an immune-driven condition going on if they're positive. Okay. If they're positive, we know there's some immune-driven condition. And so you could say, yes, you have antibodies, you get diagnosed with Hashimoto's. But if the antibodies are negative, that doesn't rule out Hashimoto's. It doesn't rule out thyroiditis. And so they are just a biomarker, but they don't tell the full story of what's going on. And just like you can't read one page of a novel and know what the whole book's about, you can't just pick one or two biomarkers and say, oh, if this thing is positive, it tells me the full detail of what's going on. And if it's negative, it tells me the full detail of what's going on in the body. The body's way more complex than that. Point 4, on the reality side of things is I would suggest that the number of seronegative patients who have hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, thyroiditis, whatever you want to call it, is maybe even higher than 30 or 35%. And the reason I say this is because we now have testing to look at what we call the T-cell population and the breakdown, the subpopulations within the T-cell population, to be able to look at these cells that contribute to most of the thyroid gland damage. And in the last 3 or 4 years that there's a lab called Cyrex Labs. I think they're a fantastic lab. Dr. Vujidani's been on the podcast before, but they developed a test called a lymphocyte map test. And it's one of my favorite tests to look at for patients with immune inflammatory thyroiditis, Hashimoto's, primary hypothyroidism, to look at for them. Why? Because if you've got a hypothyroid condition and your gland wasn't irradiated or removed, and sometimes even if it was, there's an immune-driven condition here. So we didn't really have great tools to really look at the immune system and break it down and just say, okay, what story does this T-cell subpopulation panel tell us? And now that this test is available, we can look at this, the test results, and actually get an idea of, we can know for certain which subpopulations or T-cells are elevated. And what does this pattern tell us about my patient? Is this T-cell pattern that we see here likely because of emotional stress? Is it likely because of food sensitivities, toxicities? Is it because of organisms and infections? Is it viral? Is it an intracellular? Is it extracellular? Is this maybe candida? Is it bacterial? Is it gut-based? So we can get some idea of what's driving the immune issue. We're not just trying to suppress the immune system, because the immune system may be doing exactly what it should be doing, trying to protect us. But the test, when we can break down and look at the immune system, and I've run a bunch of these tests in the last 3 to 4 years, I would tell you probably closer to 70 or 80% of the people I work with who are diagnosed with hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's are seronegative at the time that we run the test, and yet they still have immune dysregulation. So some of them are told you don't have Hashimoto's, you just have primary hypothyroidism, your gland's just not working, we just don't know why, maybe it's genetic. And some of these people have been told they're have Hashimoto's because they've had antibodies in the past, and maybe their antibodies went away and said, hey, your Hashimoto's seems better because the antibodies went away. But in reality, when we look at the lymphocyte map test, we can see their immune system is highly pushed in one direction, Th1 dominant pattern, where they have a Th17 or CD8 cell dominance, and their Th2 side of their immune system is downregulated, T-reg cells downregulated, and they're just not the person who's going to make a lot of antibodies because of their immune pattern. So the person who may have been told your Hashimoto's is better, but you still have a conversion issue, their Hashimoto's isn't better, their immune system may actually be more upregulated. So what's next? What else do we want to talk about here? So if the antibodies aren't causing the damage, what's actually causing it? And I said that it's typically T cells, pro-inflammatory T cells that are causing damage. Now, what are T cells, right? So you have, if you look at your blood work, under the CBC area, you'll see white blood cells, you'll see neutrophils, you'll see lymphocytes, you'll see monocytes, you'll see eosinophils, you see basophils. Probably nobody pays any attention to this. Now, typically, if your white blood cell count was high, somebody would say you have an acute infection. If your white blood cell count is low, unless it's really, really low, probably nobody pays attention to it. Probably nobody's paying much attention to your neutrophils, your lymphocytes, eosinophils, monocytes. Maybe some functional and integrated practitioners may pay attention to them. But T cells are part of the lymphocyte family. And I've heard some physicians that I've, say, and I've talked to physicians like, why would I run an immune panel if their lymphocytes are normal? If their lymphocytes are normal on their labs, they don't have an immune issue. The reality is that's not true at all. You can have an imbalance of the T cells and B cells in your body. You can have problems within that T cell subpopulations and still have a normal white blood cell level, a normal lymphocyte percentage. So T cells are part of your lymphocyte family. So these are more of like your chronic long-term immune defense cells. So why would your T cells cause damage to your thyroid gland in the first place? And there's different theories out there as to what's going on here. Some people would say that you have a gland called your thymus gland. It's essentially school, like a training school for your immune cells. And your lymphocytes and your T cells are sent when they're young. They're sent to the thymus gland for training. This isn't as perfect an explanation, but essentially they are trained. Your T cells are trained to say, hey, this is self tissue. This is not self tissue. Self tissue, we don't destroy. Non-self tissue, we get rid of, right? That's a threat. And so they're trained that way. And this is why we don't attack our cells on every day of our life, right? We're always cleaning up some of our dead cells or compromised cells. But we're not having constant destruction of healthy tissue because of this training by the thymus. And one of the theories of autoimmunity is that something happens that causes the thymus gland training of these T cells to not be very good. And so now these T cells leave the thymus, they leave school thinking that self tissue, like your thyroid tissue, is not self anymore and it needs to be attacked and destroyed. And that's one theory. It's not, while it may happen in some people, I don't think that's the gist of what's going on. Okay. It's my belief that in a lot of people, based on my research, what I talk about in my book, The Thyroid Debacle, what I've talked about on the podcast a lot, is that this whole big thing is not broken physiology. Your immune system didn't somehow become dysfunctional and stop recognizing self tissue one day. It didn't wake up one day and say, I don't recognize the thyroid tissue anymore as self tissue. I don't believe that that's the primary cause for hypothyroidism, Hashimoto's, thyroiditis in most people. What my belief is that when there is cell stress on the physiology and there's tissue damage, there are things called DAMPs, damage-associated molecular peptides. This is pieces of damaged tissue that go into the bloodstream and lymph. And there's things called PAMPs, pathogen-associated molecular peptides. These are pieces of organisms. When there's damage to tissue or there's an infection, you get release of DAMPs and PAMPs. And these DAMPs and PAMPs, when they get into the lymph tissue and into the bloodstream, they can bind to immune cells. And those immune cells then say, oh, I got to tell the T cell family that this is a problem. So they go out and find it and kill it. I got to tell the B cell family to make antibodies to tag this thing. So tag it wherever it is. And so the immune system can damage it and destroy it. And it is these DAMPs and PAMPs that are released from damaged tissue, that are released from destroyed organisms, that actually upregulate the immune and inflammatory process. This is not broken physiology. This is exactly what we want to happen. But based on my review of the literature, what we see today, and the literature is becoming a little bit clearer on this, is that thyroid cells have what we call pattern recognition receptors. The same receptors are on immune cells that say, hey, that's a problem. Let me grab it. Let me take it and present it to the T cells and B cells to activate them. When these DAMPs and BAMPs are in lymph and in circulation, they don't just activate the immune system, they can actually bind to your thyroid cells. And when they bind to the thyroid cells, that in itself can activate the immune cell, the thyroid cell, to become immune-like. It can trigger the activation of the immune inflammatory system in and around the thyroid tissue. It can activate what we call naive T cells in the thyroid tissue or in the tissue around the thyroid tissue and say, hey, bang, this is pattern recognition, this DAMP or PAMP binds to a thyroid receptor, pattern recognition receptor, that activates what we call the inflammasome inside these thyroid cells. That activates this whole immune activation cascade. And now we get active Th1 cells, Th17 cells, CD8 cells right in the thyroid gland. And when these thyroid cells start this inflammasome and activate these T cells, we get the release of what we call chemokines into the bloodstream that then start activating more T cells and telling them, hey, you got to come back here to the thyroid gland. We got a problem. So we could say, oh man, this is broken physiology that these DAMPs and PAMPs would activate the immune system or the thyroid cell to start almost a self-destruction process. I guess one way to look at it. But I would think the innate intelligence of the body wouldn't put these receptors on the thyroid gland unless it was part of an adaptive response. And it's my belief that when we see immune inflammatory conditions in the periphery away from the thyroid gland, that immune inflammatory process causes the decreased conversion of T4 to T3 to slow down metabolism. And we see an increased conversion of T4 to reverse T3 and an increased deactivation of T3 to T2, not as broken physiology, but as an adaptive response. And it's my belief that when we have chronic cell stress going on, that those DAMPs and PAMPs binding to the thyroid gland themselves can be potentially a protective mechanism to downregulate the body's whole metabolism. And I really believe this when we start to say, some of the cancer work and research that's out there. And I won't get into all of that today, but this is my belief that this is more of an adaptive response. And the reason I say this is because if it was just broken physiology, then people wouldn't or shouldn't recover their thyroid gland function. They shouldn't have their immune system recover, balance, and go from this very pro-inflammatory state to an anti-inflammatory state if it was broken physiology. If it's adaptive physiology and what triggered this immune inflammatory process is no longer there, then we should be able to see the immune system restore balance. We should see reduced damage to the thyroid gland, and we should be able to see the thyroid gland recover. And that's exactly what I see in my patient population. So why does all of this stuff matter? Why does it matter if the immune system is creating damage? Why does it matter if the antibodies are positive or negative? Why does it matter whether we think this is adaptive or broken physiology? The reason it matters is because if you believe that all of this is dysfunction, the thymus has a dysfunction going on, the immune system is dysfunctional, then there's very little hope for recovery. And no wonder somebody says you can't recover from a thyroid condition. No wonder somebody says you're going to need T4 and T3 medication for the rest of your life, and that you're going to have to chronically manage your thyroid physiology. If your immune system became dysfunctional and we don't know why, and it's true dysfunction and not adaptation, you're out of luck. You're going to need to be on thyroid medication for the rest of your life. But if you believe, as I do, that this is an adaptive response, then recovery is possible. Because all we have to do is address what's causing the immune and inflammatory system to be upregulated, that's causing the reduced conversion of T4 to T3, that's causing the thyroiditis. If we identify what those stressors are and reduce or eliminate those, then there's hope for recovery. Okay. And this is what I see in my client base and patient base. So how do we measure the T cells? In LabCorp Quest, they used to run CD4 versus CD8, kind of give you an idea of the balance between those two things. Some labs will do some cytokine testing, but the test I like the best at the current moment is Cyrex Labs lymphocyte map test to really measure the immune system. So it'll look at your total white cell population. It'll look at your total lymphocyte population. It'll break down T cells versus B cells. What does your immune system favor? If you favor T cells, you may have lower antibodies. If you favor B cells, you may really favor lots of antibodies. You may have one of those, hey, it's greater than measurable. It breaks the T cell population down to CD4 and CD8 ratio, like which is the body prefer here. And it's those CD8 cells that are commonly found inside a thyroid gland, actually creating the damage to the gland. They look at within the CD4 population of cells. They're not just measuring CD4, they're actually breaking the CD4 population down. So we can look at Th1 versus Th2. Th1 more pro-inflammatory, Th2 more anti-inflammatory. We can look at the Th17 versus T-reg ratio. Th17, very pro-inflammatory. T-reg, anti-inflammatory. So when we run this panel, we can see, does the T cell population favor pro-inflammatory molecules and cytokines, or does it favor an anti-inflammatory pathway or pattern? And then we can also break down what we call the natural killer cells. And that's a topic for another discussion. But when a practitioner runs a lymphocyte map test and really understands the patterns and how to break all of this stuff down, then you can it really helps us give context to what's going on. Yes, your antibodies are negative, but you have immune dysregulation. You have Hashimoto's thyroiditis for what that matters. And the reason it matters is that if you didn't know this and somebody said you don't have immune-based condition because your antibodies are negative and they just tried to manage your T4 to T3, you're probably going to be stuck in thyroid purgatory because you'd still have an immune inflammatory process going on. When we run a test like this, we can look at what is the immune dysregulation, whether you're seropositive or seronegative. And we can say, hey, listen, even though your antibodies are negative, you actually have an immune-driven damage to your thyroid gland. You're a Th1, Th17 dominant. This is a very pro-inflammatory state. And we can also look at the pattern that we see on this immune lymphocyte map panel and say, hey, this is a Th1 dominant immune dysregulation. This may be driven by an intracellular organism, or this is Th17 dominant. So this may be driven, this is very pro-inflammatory. There may be fungal issues going on here, mold, fungal issues going on, or extracellular organisms. It's Th2 dominant. So you may have higher antibodies, you have more histamine response, you may be emotional trauma going on here, maybe food sensitivity, food reactivity. So generally, a skilled clinician, somebody who's skilled in this test, can look at the pattern that shows up on this test and then really dictate, oh, this is the pattern, this is most likely what we're dealing with, and then provide an appropriate strategy. Or we can say, hey, this looks like an intracellular organism pattern, and then run next level testing that may look for virus or intracellular bacteria or even fungi, right? So we can then run an appropriate test to kind of clarify, what are we specifically dealing with here from an organism standpoint, and then provide an appropriate strategy. So the other thing that's really important here is that if we can find the drivers that are creating this immune imbalance, and we can lower those drivers or reduce or eliminate those drivers of the immune imbalance, now the immune system can calm down. We can see these Th1, Th17, and CD8 cells kind of lower. We can see the T-reg, maybe Th2 cells those anti-inflammatory cells start to rise and actually turn off the immune system naturally. And with that, we'll get reduced thyroid gland damage, and the person can actually start to recover their thyroid physiology if it hasn't been that much destruction or atrophy. If we drive down the drivers of immune inflammatory issues, we see decreased inflammatory cytokines. And if we see reduced inflammatory cytokines, we see less tissue damage. We see less overall inflammation in the body. We see improved conversion of T4 to T3. So T3 goes up naturally, total, free T3, and reverse T3 goes down naturally. So I want to wrap this up by giving just a couple takeaways. One of those is, if you have a thyroid condition, you should be thinking, if the gland wasn't removed or irradiated, that the most likely driver, it's an immune-driven condition. And if somebody says, well, we have to run antibodies to determine if you have an immune-based condition, be aware that the antibodies may be normal, negative, and you may still have an immune condition, and more likely you do. But it's not being picked up on an antibody test because the pattern of your immune dysregulation. If you have thyroid antibodies, that confirms you have an immune-driven condition, and you may not have to do, ultrasounds and other those things to confirm it, but it just says, hey, yeah, we have a biomarker here that says the immune system is dysregulated, producing antibodies against self-tissue, but it shouldn't change from a functional medicine standpoint. Whether the antibodies are there or not, it shouldn't change our thinking process in functional medicine. We should still be thinking it's a 90% chance it's an immune-driven condition with or without the positive antibodies. And I need to, or you need to, as the client, figure out what's contributing to your excessive stress load that's driving the immune inflammatory condition, resulting in the adaptive immune activation on your immune system, causing the adaptive decreased conversion of T4 to T3. So what I would suggest that you do is put less focus on manipulating the blood levels of T4, T3, or antibodies or reverse T3, and more focus on what's driving my immune system. Because if you address what's driving the immune system to be dysregulated, that is going to get you to more closer to a recovery process than spending lots of time and money going from doctor to doctor to doctor to try and manipulate a T3, a free T3, a reverse T3, or thyroid antibodies into range with supplementation or medications. That is a strategy to manage your condition, but I don't feel for most people it leads to a recovery state. Okay. That doesn't mean if you just want to do management that you're right or that you're wrong. It just means that's what you choose. Most of the people that come to see me are trying to recover, and that requires a different strategy than trying to manipulate a T4, a TSH, a T3, a reverse T3, or antibodies into range with medication or supplements. A recovery strategy focuses on what's driving body to behave this way and how do we reduce or eliminate those stressors so the immune system can calm down, the immune system stops damaging the gland gets a chance to recover, and the body does a better job converting T4 to T3, and you get sufficient T3 inside the cells and you feel and function back to normal. All right. So that wraps up this episode of Thyroid Shorts. And if there is, as I said at the start, if there's a topic that you would like to have covered on one of these Thyroid Answers Shorts, or if there's a guest you'd like me to interview on the Thyroid Answers podcast long form, please send me a message at info@drericbalcavage.com. And if you like the podcast or love the podcast, please go to wherever you download your podcasts and give me a rating for the podcast. All right. I appreciate any feedback. I do most of this for you, the listeners and the followers, to try and give you as much information and context as possible. Take care.